Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Torben. Thank you to the Institute for hosting me. And most of all, thanks to all of you for showing up and be willing to listen to me in English. I am much appreciative. My German is about 10 words, so it would be very ugly if I tried to pantomime my talk. So we come in an interesting moment for American politics. I assume that's what you're here to hear about. America is in flux. Maybe it's almost always in flux of some kind or another. Right now, I think I would make the case that the United States is suffering from a crisis of political legitimacy. Who has the right to lead? Who has the wisdom to lead? Who has the authority to lead? And that these are questions both for liberals and conservatives, for Democrats and Republicans, that have no clear answers in 2016. And so what I'd like to talk to you today about is in some senses of how do we get to this place, and what does it mean for American politics, and perhaps for world affairs as well. So the first thing to think about in some ways is what Torben has suggested, which is that the Republican Party, the constituency of which is overwhelmingly conservative, has fallen into disarray. How is it that a man like Donald Trump, never been elected to political office, has no clear political ideology, has no firm set of political principles, has no clear allies within the Republican Party establishment? How does a figure like that, from the outside, he truly is, at least politically speaking, from the outside, how does he do, as Torben, I think, put it well, create a hostile takeover, something from his business career he knows well? How does he create a constituency, voters, willing to say, let's take a chance on this new person who we don't know very well, who doesn't speak to the same principles as prior leaders of the Republican Party, but who we believe in? And so I'm going to talk today in some ways about the development of conservatism and the Republican Party, and then the factors that led to its fracturing, to its breaking apart. And the slide I have up here shows you the sort of battleground that's occurring right now within the Republican Party in the United States, where the man who had been the most prominent Republican in the United States, the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, is not sure what to make of the presumptive nominee, now almost certainly the nominee of the Republican Party, Donald Trump. So we're seeing a division within the Republican Party. We're seeing, I think, the crack-up of the conservative movement in the United States. So this is a process that, from a historian's perspective, is still not old. This is, as, again, Torben suggested to you, a movement that's taken decades to form, but certainly not centuries. That the movement toward creating a conservative party in the United States, not a conservative philosophy, not a conservative ideology, but a party structure built on the ideology of conservatism, is a relatively new figure in the United States. Traditionally in the United States, political parties had been non-ideological. They'd been composed of different components, peoples with different interests that aligned usually temporarily and not based on a set of overarching principles. This did begin to change in the United States, beginning already in the 1930s. So the 1930s in the United States was sort of the first crisis. I talked about a politics of flux, a politics of a crisis of legitimacy in the United States. You have to go back a long way in the United States to find that founding moment, that last great moment of flux. And it was in the 1930s. And it's at this point that, in some ways, modern politics in the United States begins. And it's useful even in the 21st century, I think, maybe because I'm a historian, to see that kind of development occur. And it's in the 1930s that the two parties begin to try to adjudicate, to make decisions about their ideological identities. The man who becomes the first and most preeminent liberal in the United States, the man who takes the Democratic Party and says, this party represents a new political philosophy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only president of the United States who was elected to 4 terms in office, who goes from the 1930s all the way into the mid-1940s. When he becomes elected, he had no ideology. He didn't have an identity to call himself in political principled terms. There's a famous story in the 1930s, after his landslide victory as president, a reporter comes up to Franklin Roosevelt and he says to him, "Sir, this is an incredible moment in the history of the United States. Can you explain to our readers, what is your political philosophy? And Roosevelt looks at him with a blank face. And he says, political philosophy? This is a man who had gone to Harvard University and had gotten gentleman's C's. He was not a very good student. And he said, I guess I'm a Christian and I'm a Democrat. And then he smiled. That was his philosophy. He didn't have one, is the point. But over time, he develops a philosophy based on economic principles, that something had gone wrong in the United States, that too much power had been concentrated in the hands of the wealthy, that business, and especially the economic elites, would need some sort of counterbalance, and that the state was the only institution powerful enough to create that counterbalance. So he invents what he calls himself modern liberalism. Liberals in the United States had traditionally been opposed to centralized power. Liberals in the United States had been opposed to a powerful religious presence in the United States. But after that, there was not a lot of lucidity or clearness to what it meant to be a liberal. Roosevelt added a third piece to that liberal identity. We're not just opposed to too powerful a state. We're not just opposed to too powerful a religious establishment. We're also opposed to too powerful a concentration of economic power. Modern liberalism. Not surprisingly, the business community in the United States was appalled. And you start to get an ideologically defined opposition in the United States over principles of political economy. What is the role of the state in disciplining the marketplace? And big business began to organize to try to counter what they saw as a kind of revolution in the United States, a turn toward a kind of democratic socialism in the United States, though a weak form of it in the United States. Here's the point I want to make in these early days, and it's worth thinking about. In the 1930s and in the 1940s, okay, a long time ago, but still, the business community was not sure which party to support, Democrats or Republicans. It wasn't like one party was pro-business and one party was anti-business. The business community still hoped they could control both parties, that they had the economic wealth and the influence, that both parties would be pro-business. So it wasn't like the business community solidly rounded itself up and joined the Republican Party. This would be a slow process over time and would still be a divided question. But the beginning of an economic conservative mobilization based on principle, the market comes first, the state comes second, and a very distant second, begins in the United States. So the first conservatives in the United States are the business community, our economic elites, are people who want to hold on to the power they had. Okay, we're a democracy in the United States, right? You have to have elections. You have to elect an official, whether it's the local level or Congress or the presidency. If in the 1930s or 40s you came out as a politician and said, hello, I am for economic elite power. I believe that big business knows best how to handle all problems in the United States, that the free market will solve all your needs. People would say, you're crazy. We just had a Great Depression. The banks failed in the United States. Giant corporations fired 50, 60, 70% of their employees. I'm not voting for you people. You're crazy if you think I'll support such a policy. So economic conservatives had a very difficult time consolidating political power in the United States. So both political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, essentially accepted the idea that the market had to be regulated, that there had to be some sort of social provision system, some sort of general social welfare system established by the federal government. And the Republicans who win, President Eisenhower, even President Nixon, remember President Nixon was the vice president to President Eisenhower. So in the 1950s and 60s, the Republican Party did not call itself a conservative party. Eisenhower famously said, I'm creating a modern Republican Party, by which he meant, I accept much of the New Deal. I accept that the state must discipline the market, but with some differences. Now, there were people who opposed that separate piece with the new liberal state. And those are the people we're interested in. Those are the people who are still wrestling with the idea of, well, how do you create a winning political coalition that can create a conservative power base and can take over at least one of the political parties? But how do you do it? How do you find warm bodies, human beings, who will show up in November on election day, whether for Congress or the president, and support a conservative set of principles embodied by a conservative politician? You cannot win just with economic elites. There just aren't enough of them. It's a losing Democratic minority. So you start to see in the 1950s and 1960s an attempt by these economic elites, they're still at the backbone of the conservative movement, the hope by conservatives to take over at least one political party, and now they're fixed on the Republican Party, the non-New Deal originating party in the United States. And they begin to think through, how do you reach a new constituency? Right? Politics is about combining different groups, especially in a two-party system where you have limited choices. So I put a slide up here of William Buckley, an intellectual, a public intellectual. He runs magazines. Eventually he'll have a television show. He's someone who's trying to reach out to the broad public, albeit an erudite, well-educated man. And Buckley saw an opportunity. He said, in the United States right now, many religious people, and America, don't forget, arguably is the most religious society in the modern industrial world. There are many religious people who can be made to understand that their interests are the same as the economic elite, even if they're not wealthy people. How? Well, all of us, religious people and economically minded people, are anti-communist. Some are anti-communist because it would destroy a free market, it would destroy corporate consolidation, the ability to invest capital in new marketplaces. That's the economic elite. Some are anti-communist for other reasons. It's an immensely repressive form of government. It's anti-religion. It's atheistic. It persecutes people of religious faith. You hear? A winning move. It doesn't matter how true or untrue the claim is. What matters is this is a different way to think about mobilizing voters to get a new kind of coalition. So Buckley makes the case we're all anti-communists. Some of us for narrow economic reasons, some of us for broad religious reasons, but we can come together under the banner of anti-communism based on this principle. And if you are an anti-communist of this kind, you're a conservative. And most people, that was not a label that came easily to them. Conservative is a strange word in the United States. We're a proudly revolutionary society, a proudly progressive society. Americans are probably the only country in the world that thinks we were born perfect with the Constitution and we get better every day. So progressive, forward-looking, natural ethos. Conservatives are backward-looking, tradition-respecting, not oriented toward progress and perfection. So conservative is not a natural label in the United States. It had not been used in political discourse traditionally in the United States. But now, it's starting to be something that pulls not just at the heartstrings of a narrow segment of the population, the most well-to-do, who are calling themselves conservatives in opposition to the liberal New Deal, but also a larger group of religiously motivated voters who see in anti-communism a bond, a connection to this other group. You're starting to get a plausible political movement, but still not enough. Not enough to win the Republican nomination. Again, Eisenhower, then Nixon in 1960, moderates, centrists, not conservatives in the normative sense. How do you get new voters? Again, it's a game, right? If you're a political strategist, just be cynical for a minute. I know none of you are. But if you're cynical, you're just trying to find 51% of the vote under a banner that combines peoples together who are not natural allies. So you've sort of got two legs of a stool now. You've got economic elites, You've got religiously motivated people who are primarily concerned about anti-communism. That will fade eventually, but it's a good core for 30 years. What else can you get? Whom else can you ally? This comes to a critical decision point in 1964. Again, a long time ago, but believe me, these things, as we say, have legs. They carry on for decades. In 1964, there was a contest within the party of the Republicans, would a moderate win again, like Richard Nixon had in '60, or would there be a conservative? And the conservative force for the Republican Party was a man named Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, not well known, not a national figure at this point. And Goldwater saw a new opportunity to create, again, a bigger coalition, more people who would think of themselves as conservatives. 1964 is a pivotal year in the United States. It's the year that the civil rights movement reaches its apogee, its highest point in some senses. There were protests all over the country. Congress had begun to pass legislation that would make legal segregation and legal discrimination end in the United States. This was very divisive in the United States, especially among white Southerners. So white Southerners were still trying to hold on to their traditional beliefs. Social hierarchy, the sense that there was a racial difference in the United States, that over centuries there had been a preference for whites over black, and that this was natural and part of the customs of a people. Richard Nixon, who had run in 1960 as the Republican, a name that sort of will live in infamy, but on racial issues, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy were essentially the same. Both pro-integration, anti-racists, believed that the federal government had a role to play in creating racial justice. No difference between the Republicans and the Democrats as late as 1960. Barry Goldwater says, conservative principles say that powerful centralized governments in which the federal government has the right to interfere in everyday businesses, in who gets to sell a house, who gets to buy a house, who gets to serve a customer, or who does not get to serve a customer, who gets to hire a person or not hire a person. These are liberal precepts that the government has the right to make those determinations. Conservatives believe in the market. Let the market decide these things. So I, Barry Goldwater, am opposed to any government intervention on questions of racial equality in the United States. Let people themselves figure out these racial matters. Now, Goldwater understands that to make that statement is to reach out to a new constituency, white Southerners, who never thought of themselves as conservative, who had traditionally voted Democratic, had voted for the liberals. But on race, these people could be perceived as conservative. And Goldwater says famously, again, it's a funny expression in English, if we're going to win this election in 1964, we have to go hunting where the ducks are. Hunting where the ducks are, meaning you got to go wherever you can find what you need. And what we need to win a majority for conservative Republicans is new people. And those new people, well, they'll be white supremacists, those who still believe in white superiority in the United States. A devil's bargain of a kind that the conservative movement was willing to make. This is very divisive within conservatism. It's not like all conservatives said, this is good, this is what we should do. This is a great divide. And if we had time, I could tell you the historical details, but I have a feeling that's what we say, in the weeds. But the Republican Party begins to flirt with a third group of voters, those who are still supporters of old social hierarchies. So first, it's white over black. And then that continues. So again, quote, Democrats like to highlight this fact that the modern conservative movement was built in some ways around questions about the issue of race. And you'll hear some of that in 2016 in the rhetoric between the two parties. But this also takes place over all those other social movement battles during the 1960s even through today. So the issue of gender rights, of women's equality, becomes another dividing point between the two parties and the two ideologies. Conservatives overwhelmingly maintain the idea that men have natural rights over women, that there's a complementary relationship between men and women. Women are homemakers, women are mothers, but women are not public individuals. They shouldn't participate in the market. They shouldn't demand full equity in other assets of other facets of American life. That there's a natural order, a traditional order, and that we as conservatives should conserve those past relationships. Social hierarchy. For religious people, this is particularly appealing. Many Protestants, many Catholics look at the Bible as a source of guidance, and they see that kind of language. Complementary relationships, but a hierarchical relationship between genders. Here becomes another dividing line between conservatives and liberals, and add new constituencies, new peoples who are mobilized. Not necessarily so much new voters, but people who are motivated enough, who feel strongly about issues like this, abortion, a very prominent one, who will go talk to their neighbors, who will donate money to political causes, who will organize at their schools and at their communities and at their churches. In America, it's not about winning 51% of 100% of Americans. Winning elections is about winning 51% of those people who are political, who vote. In congressional elections in the United States, only about 1/3 to 40% of Americans vote. You don't need to win 51% of American voters. You need to win 18, 19% of American voters. So if you have passionate people, it's more important than winning over 100 people who don't actually vote, who don't show up on election day. Germany, I think it's 80, 90% of people vote still in elections. No. I'm looking backward. Nowadays, 70%, 60%? Okay. In the United States, a great presidential turnout is about 55, 56%. Congressional, 38, 37%. Okay, so we're all becoming the same. My last slide will show how we're all the same. Not always for the best. So this continues, this kind of turn toward social issues. This is what I want to hammer home. Core voters, economic elites form the conservative movement. Increasingly, you get more and more people motivated by other kinds of issues, anti-communism, religious sensibilities, social issues that have to do often with hierarchies, white over black, men over women, straight over gay. These become critical issues, and the conservative movement is expanding, and there are principles to explain why this is coherent, but it's not determinative, right? These are decision points. We say, as social scientists, contingent points. It didn't have to go this way. So people are choosing how to expand their constituency. So you get by the 1970s a much broader kind of conservative movement. And in terms of rank and file, you know what I mean? In terms of a majority of voters, still economic conservatives in numbers are smaller. There just aren't enough rich people who want total free market determination of everyday life decisions. There's a lot of them, but not enough to win elections. But you bring in these other issues, and you're getting closer. Still, it doesn't work for a while, and you need a kind of, I don't know if it's a catalyst or a cause. You know what I mean? It's not clear if this is a cause and effect relationship or things are stirring enough that you just need one more change. And the point I would emphasize that's still relevant, again for 2016, is somewhere in the 1970s, into the 1980s, in the United States, that New Deal economic order, that set of principles and policies that had been instituted in the 1930s, begin to fray, begin not to work as effectively for the American people. A highly regulated, state-bound, high-tax society with fairly liberal social provisions starts to become, in the eyes of many Americans, less effective in a new kind of global economic situation. So the United States in the 1950s, even through the 1960s, were economic hegemons. Europe is still recovering from the war. Japan is still coming out of the rubble the United States is able to take full advantage of having few true economic competitors in the world. By the 1970s, that's changed. The United States enters a world in which there's real economic competition again, in which certain sectors of the American economy that had been very high-paying especially come under critical attention. Automobiles, steel, electronics, the big core industries in the United States. Suddenly, they're not economically competitive against global competition. What do? How do you revive an American economy for the first time facing a new economic order in the world? Liberals kind of try to hang on to those principles that had worked so well for 30 years, that had created a very affluent working class in the United States, that had created great security for working people in the United States. Conservatives begin to argue, see, we told you, our market-based system, in the end, you have to pay attention to it. The laws of economics haven't changed. And now we need to start thinking about new ways to organize America to be competitive again. And what you start to see is a more pro-capital movement, a turn away from liberals' concerted efforts to create a fair and equitable economy based to some extent on closed systems. Our car companies didn't really compete with each other or with anyone in the world. We had a consolidation of great corporations that managed competition more than they reveled in competition. That doesn't work by the 1970s and early 80s. So when the core principle of liberalism begins seemingly not to pay effective outcomes, it opens the door for a new kind of politics. So the Happy Cowboy, the ex-actor, an outsider, albeit an outsider who had been a two-term governor of the largest state in the United States and the richest state in the United States at that point, California. So he did have political experience, but was an actor, speaks to all those constituencies: economic conservatives, religious conservatives, social conservatives, and says to those Americans who had still voted Democratic in 1976 for Jimmy Carter, the President of the United States, still elected Democratic congressmen and Democratic senators, he said, so how's that working for you now when you're unemployed, when inflation is going through the roof, when you can't compete with Europe, with Germany, with Asia, with Japan? Your old enemies have come back and are stealing your lunch. What are you going to do? So Reagan said, let the market work its magic. And it was a kind of magical realism, a hope that somehow you could turn the clock back, let capital win its way back into the favor of the American people, and become triumphant. The liberals were wrong, said Ronald Reagan. It's time to try something new. And so you get a very successful political movement that begins to start to rewrite the rule book in the United States. And those conservative principles that have been combined together, creating this kind of odd alliance of lower income religious people, racists, sexists, cosmopolitan, elite business people, is able to elect a president, and a president who means it, who's able to implement a series of policies that begin to change the rules of the game. And to some extent, politically and economically, it works. The United States does see a resurgence in the 1980s. There is new growth in new sectors of the economy. Deregulation begins to help in many aspects of American society. So new answers, new growth, new economic development, new winners in the US economy. Reagan pairs this new approach to domestic issues with a kind of, in some ways, a return to an old American style again, a 1920s style in America, where he begins to walk away from the idea that the United States is fully integrated into a world community, that the United States is strongest when it works most closely with its allies, that the United States is at its best when it's able to use economic organization and geopolitical balancing to win a stable world in which American interests are maintained and American principles can be exported. Reagan says, we don't need that. We're the strongest country in the world. We should exercise our muscles as we see fit. We don't need to integrate our policies with others. We rule. We lead. We are America. We are exceptional. We're like no other country. We are inherently moral, which means you know who, Europe, is not. We don't need to be listening to others. So a different style, a very nationalist style, which again is music to the ears of many Americans who had always been uncomfortable with the costs associated with international cooperation, international support, and a lack of autonomy in our own affairs. So again, a kind of winning electoral move, which is pushing the United States in a different direction. So, to cut to the chase, this becomes again a kind of new consensus in the United States. These conservative principles that Ronald Reagan so successfully champions forced the Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, to move in the direction of conservatism. So in the 1990s, the Democrats win back the White House, but by carefully, what we say in the United States, triangulating, creating a triangle between conservatives, liberals, and moderate positions. The President of the United States, the husband of the nominee of the Democratic Party, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton respectively, moves toward the middle. He's like a Dwight Eisenhower of Democrats. He accepts some of the conservatism of his opponents. He doesn't try to contest them openly. Some cases, yes, but not generally. So this becomes the new political order in the United States. It's a new kind of stability. So from the 1980s all the way into the 21st century, you have a new kind of consensus in the United States. The political economy question seems to have been settled again. Let the market determine fundamental values in the United States. Let the state intervene only rarely and carefully in the affairs of everyday Americans. Except in one area. By the 21st century, those issues of social hierarchy had diminished in importance. Here there was a kind of meeting of minds. Racism had become unacceptable for either party or either ideology. Sexism, mostly unacceptable to even conservatives, though not in all instances. Sexual preference issues, gay and straight issues, those still had saliency, still were politically viable for conservatives. But there's changes. So Torben said that I wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Conservatism. I thought, after the Bush years, that conservatism, like liberalism in the 1970s, had found its own contradictions and was imploding from within. As I suggest, in one case, most Americans had begun to accept new relationships between minority and majority groups. Black and white, that was an unpleasant political issue for most Americans. Whites did not want to be perceived as racist. It was unacceptable, it was illegitimate. Young Americans really didn't care about issues of sexual preference. It was, again, uncomfortable. There was a democratization of the American people, especially those below 40. On political economy issues, the great bank failures of 2007, 2008 made it seem like, well, maybe some regulation of the financial sector, some oversight by the government to make sure that Wall Street bankers don't issue bonds that have no legitimacy. Maybe there should be some concern about that. Maybe our unilateralism, our sense that we're different than all other countries and that whatever we do in foreign affairs is by nature, because we're American, moral and necessary. Well, after Iraq, that didn't look so good either. So some of these core conservative principles that had unified this disparate, fragile coalition of people, it seemed like they were not working once again.
for the American people. And to me, it seemed obvious when a black man with the unlikely name of Barack Hussein Obama becomes president of the United States, who runs on a straightforwardly progressive agenda, wins the presidency. It strikes me at that point, maybe conservatism has come undone. For the first time in 2 decades, a nationally important campaign is run opposing conservatism at all levels. Now, it's interesting, Obama did not call himself a liberal. That word had become somewhat discredited in American political rhetoric. He called himself a progressive, a word that goes all the way back to the beginnings of the 20th century. But you could see, pro-government. There's a time for government services. There's a need to create a more equal society. There's a need for us to look at each other not as just atomized individuals, living in our suburban moats, not caring about our neighbors, to a place with more community and solidarity between peoples. You know, a very leftist-oriented kind of rhetoric. And this black guy with a Muslim name, Christian, but with a Muslim name, right? He wins the presidency. Has a page turned in American life. Well, yes and no, right? Yes and no. Obama does create a progressive agenda in the United States, especially on social issues, especially on the character of leadership in the United States. But, and there is a but, when it came to core economic concerns, Obama, the progressive, did not change many of the fundamentals of everyday life for Americans. So I put up here the concentration of wealth in the United States. Whether it was Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, or Barack Obama, that concentration of wealth, that economic inequality has continued to be determinative of everyday life for the American people. So liberal, progressive, conservative, none of it seems to change that core problem. If you're a working class American, you've seen your life become insecure, fragile. You're not sure if your children will live even as good as you live. They might face diminishing expectations of how their lives will live. This is a riddle. Neither ideology has really solved this critical problem for the American people. Now, part of that is because there is political gridlock in the United States. Neither conservatives nor liberals over the last 8 years, Democrats or Republicans, have been able to offer wholesale changes to fundamental questions of how economics works. There's such a fierce divide on policy considerations that there's been almost no changes on these kinds of issues. That's true, but it doesn't make it less frustrating for Americans as they try to figure out, what will my old age be like? What will my children's lives be like? Where will my grandchildren get a job in the mid-21st century? Now, combined with that is a sense that the economy is not working for regular people. Too much wealth is concentrated, not enough opportunity for the middle or the working class. So why is that? Enter Donald Trump. Whose fault is this? So the answer is right. We could spend hours trying to think through why has this happened to many advanced industrial countries, globalization, changing structures of economic development, complicated conversation. Politicians do not revel, especially in the United States, in complicated economic discussions. Sometimes simple answers are easier to digest. Immigration. The United States is changing. 17% of the population in the United States is Hispanic today. The fastest growing segment of the United States population is Hispanic. By 2050, the prediction is that the United States will be a so-called majority-minority country. There'll be fewer white people in the United States than people of color in the United States. I'm a white person, what does that mean for me? Donald Trump is interested in picking that wound that many white people feel has been inflicted upon them. Trade. Who steals our jobs? At home, immigrants. Abroad, Mexicans, Japanese, Germans. Who's stealing? Who's stealing? Stealing, right? Powerful word. Who's stealing our jobs? Americans are worried. We're the great champions of free trade. It made sense for us when we were the most powerful economic country in the world. The British were the great champions of free trade before us when they were the most powerful economic country in the world. Is it good or bad? Well, it depends, right? Suddenly a dialogue begins. Is this long-standing tradition of free trade, which only goes back to the 1930s, before that the United States was a protectionist country, is this really good for us? There's Donald Trump. He doesn't fit this story I'm telling you about conservatives versus liberals. But he takes some of the ways in which conservatives have won power. There is a natural hierarchy. His hierarchies are a little different. Immigrants are the real enemy of Americans. Muslims are the real enemies, all of them, of the United States. There's outgroups. It's not blacks. It's not women. Well, we'll get to that. Maybe it's women. It's not gays. He lives in New York City. He doesn't have much issue with gay people. He's grown up in that world. But there's a new other, a new hierarchy. Christian over Muslim. Native-born over immigrant. So that the same principle, but with new figures involved. Trade. Again, repudiating conservative economics. Let the market decide. Trump says, the market's not fair. You need a great authoritative figure, a leader who can beat other people, who can be a winner for Americans, stop their thefts, stop them stealing, stop them cheating. It's not a fair market. I can do this for you. I, the great leader. Conservative, liberal, reactionary, a different language. Trump is combining elements. I say he's a new conservative. He still believes in the power of the economic elite. He still believes in hierarchies. He doesn't champion equality. But it's definitely a new kind of conservatism in the United States. Obviously successful. He just won the nomination of one of the major parties in the United States with a new kind of formula. Same themes, different specifics. Will Americans abide by this? Will they accept a new kind of understanding of the world? Market people believe in comparative advantage. Right? Some countries are good at some things, some countries are good at other things. If we realize what we're good at, we can compete globally effectively. That's free trade. Trump says that's a bunch of BS. He would use the real swear word. He says there's winners and losers. There's cheaters, and they're out to get us, and I can defeat them. We don't all get along. We're in a race for victory. And I will lead us to win again. So it's a language, a rhetoric that's new to conservatism. And again, you could almost transpose this language onto African Americans 60 years ago. Now the language is Mexicans, dangerous people, rapists. I mean, it's kind of an amazing statement to brand this massive group of tens of millions of people as our enemy, as dangerous. So again, you can see a tradition in this in conservatism, a willingness to make what I called before a devil's bargain, to reach out to people who through fear, through anger, are motivated politically. Trump is happy to meet them where they live. So something that Torben and I have been talking about, that scholars, at least in Europe and the United States, are talking about, is there now a kind of new convergence on the right between Europe and the United States? It used to be that I would make the case that American conservatism is quite different than, let's say, the National Front in France. Conservatives in the United States opposed social welfare, they opposed worker benefits, they opposed unionization, they opposed any sense that there should be a social safety net. In Europe, there's a sense, well, some of us deserve those benefits on the right. It's just them that shouldn't get those things. So we're starting to see a strange kind of convergence, I think, with a new kind of conservatism that might be transnational, even as it's very nationalistic at the same time. Donald Trump, is he more like your kind of rightist? Is he more like our kind of conservative? Or are we creating a new kind of political dichotomy in the United States and in Europe between those who see a narrow nationalist, nativist movement as the only way to save ourselves from international competition and large demographic changes? Or is there a more progressive message? The 2016 election in the United States will be about those issues. Thank you very much. Good. So we welcome questions from the audience. Thank you.
Sit over here. We move over.
Yeah, we can go here. So thank you very much for this really great speech, integrating so many different perspectives and also very entertaining. Just
I hope so.
And we learned a lot from you. And the idea of learning something about today by looking back and finding analogies, I think that was pretty fascinating. Thank you for this. So I'm just here for the case, actually, that someone wants to ask a question in German. I'm happy to translate. Wasn't the case last time. Probably won't be the case today. But just in case you're eager to ask something and you're kind of hesitating, I'm willing to translate. So we ask for questions.
I think you're right. I think that's something that I underplayed. It's a very provocative issue in the United States right now. Is Trump less a conservative and more an authoritarian figure? That Americans are turning to him because they simply want, to use a throwback to more dangerous times, a strong leader, regardless of the specificity of his policy prescriptions. And I think there's much truth to that. I think there's a strain in conservatism that has always welcomed that kind of strong disciplinary figure, a figure who says people who want grassroots change, people who are stirring protest and dissent, people who are demanding new rights, those are troublemakers and they have to be squashed. In part, Ronald Reagan's rise to fame was through the same ability to be an authoritarian figure in California, to champion forces of law and order against Black civil rights protest, against student protest, against anti-war protest. So there's always a kind of echo of that authoritarian figure among many conservatives. But Trump is something new, much more forthright in his willingness to call on his own personal ability to solve every problem, not ideology. I'm a smart man, he says over and over. I'm a genius, he sometimes says. Who do you look to for advice? I listen to myself, he says. So yeah, a different kind of figure. So I think that authoritarian thing, that scares a certain percentage of Americans. Thank you. Yeah, fascinating and good question. So the United States, maybe, we like to think that the United States is exceptional, but I think we're more like almost every other country. There's the America we pretend to be, and there's the America we really are. So we pretend to be a country that has put up a Statue of Liberty, and we love all people to come. Give me your tired, your poor, your refuse. That's from you Europeans, the refuse, garbage. Come to our country, we welcome you. Well, there's truth to that, When Germans came to the United States in the mid-19th century, they were overwhelmingly welcomed, become the largest immigrant group in the United States. When people from England come, when people from Scotland come, they're welcome to the United States. But when Chinese come, they were never welcomed. An act was made to exclude them. They could never become citizens. No Asians born in Asia could be citizens of the United States until after World War II. No people of color could be naturalized, become citizens in the United States. So, right, there's a side of us that's probably more normal in the world. We like people like us, meaning the white Christian majority, Protestant majority. Catholic Germans had a harder time than Protestant. So that's always been an argument in the United States. They're pro-immigration factions, but there have always been anti-immigrant factions. The Irish were not welcomed. People of color were not welcomed. Eventually, Eastern and Southern Europeans, overwhelmingly Catholic or Orthodox, were not welcomed after 1920. So, right, who we like to be, Statue of Liberty, who we really are, a more mixed bag. This is the uglier side of the United States. The other example you raise is really fascinating, which is, I always say, if you look at any time of political flux, any time when there's really a great debate in the United States, you often will see the right and the left, somewhere in the back, almost shaking hands with each other. Because the problems are real. You know, do great banks in Wall Street have too much power? Yeah, both the left and the right seem to agree sometimes, yeah, too much power. Is there a health care crisis in the United States? Obviously, there's a health care crisis in the United States. They're unavoidable. Do people who only have high school educations in the United States have a hard time getting decent jobs in the United States? Yes. They're just factually true. So you see sometimes everybody recognizing the problem. Do Trump and Sanders have the same answers? Trump, I have no idea what he thinks about big banks. I have no idea. His populist rhetoric would suggest, yeah, I'm opposed to these cheating, loser, bad men who run. But he's in bed with these people. So I don't know. When it comes to healthcare, Trump will often say, I believe every American has the right to healthcare. Sounds like Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders says, yeah, I want a system like Canada, a one-payer system, the government runs healthcare programs, it's going to be perfect, everybody will be happy. Trump just says everyone will be happy. He doesn't say how. So they recognize some of the same problems. And I think what you're saying is hundreds of millions of Americans say, we have real problems. Can the people who've been creating these problems for decades solve them? Or do we need outsiders? And so Bernie Sanders on the left, not even a Democrat till about an hour and a half ago, he's an outsider. Trump, an outsider. So, you know, real problems. We're at a moment when suddenly new voices can be heard. Dangerous voices and less dangerous voices. Again, if you watch the Republican Party right now, they don't know what to do. So they recognize the power of Trump, that he won the nomination. I mean, I gave speeches all over China over the summer, and I had a slideshow and all the major candidates. I didn't have Donald Trump up there. This is in July. I thought he was a joke. I think most Republican leaders never thought, they never imagined that he would become the nominee of the party. So what do you do? If you're Paul Ryan, this very principled man, I mean, whatever you think of him, he has very firm conservative principles. He's very intelligent. He can explain them in detail. You see him now, Speaker of the House, the leading Republican elected official in the United States. He's like, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure about this man. I need to talk to him. They're having these formal meetings now where Trump is going to say something like, yeah, get in line. And Ryan will say, can you please just throw me a bone? Just something so I don't look like a fool to endorse you. They don't know what to do. The real question is, will they recognize that the new base of the party, and I had a slide like this, is white, working class voters, that will be the difference between winning and losing elections. Demographically, that's a loser over time. There just aren't enough of them. So do you try to win one or two more election cycles Or do you say, we'll never win the presidency again if we maintain Trumpism? They don't know the answer. I'm really curious what they do. The argument for a third party in the United States is very difficult to make. The electoral laws in the United States make it very difficult for a third party to gain enough power. It's possible. There's no law that makes it impossible. There's no constitutional, procedural issues. It's just in terms of money, networks, institutions, donors, the people who pay for politics. It's so hard to do. I mean, it's been tried, but it hasn't worked. I think what you're more likely to see is actually further movement on the Democratic side toward trying to win back working voters, working class people. So Bernie Sanders will have a big influence on the Democratic Party. You'll see more attention to fair trade. You'll see more attention to creating a higher floor for working class Americans, higher wages, greater benefits, more assurances of social provision. So that part of the party will move left. The Republican Party, I think, is trying to figure that out. You know, where do they move, if anywhere? I think if Hillary Clinton wins 56, 57% of the vote, that'd be a big victory in the United States. The Republican Party will split over these issues. And we'll be in big trouble at the national level, and we don't know which side will win yet. But I don't think a third party can happen. It's just so difficult to do. But I didn't think Donald Trump would be the Republican nominee either, so we'll see.
Who else? Okay, then I take the privilege of asking a question. Oh, I need to take the microphone too, of course. It's also going to be recorded. Okay. I just want to go back to history a little bit, because what you've presented, isn't that in a way a very liberal narrative and very comforting for liberals of saying, you know, there were these healthy people, they were backing all these causes, you know, they financed it, they looked for candidates. But I mean, the idea that the free market should do it, that it is a society, you know, that is less maybe built on social solidarity, but more opportunity, isn't that older than the conservative movement itself? So if you look back at the Gilded Age in the 19th century, so because it still sounds a little bit like, so there were wealthy people trying to advance their own causes, and then they were looking for a constituency and they sold them something, but maybe not the thing they really wanted. But isn't that a very liberal narrative in a sense of saying, you know, actually, you know, they sold something, but the real thing was something different?
So the other side to this is, well, to some extent, yeah, you maybe heard my politics, but to the other side of this is, if you're living in the southwest of the United States, you don't live in New York on the East Coast, and you are a working person, you're a middle-class person trying to make sure your family's okay, how do you compete effectively? Do you throw in your politics with your boss or with your co-worker? And it doesn't make you stupid, it doesn't make you irrational to say, my boss, he built a good business. He hired me. I'm making a living here. I like this business. I think it's a good business. The only way my boss can succeed is if there's less government regulation. A union would kill our factory. It would kill our department store. I understand where my boss is coming from. It makes sense to me economically. Again, people have to choose. And I think in the United States, and this, I don't know if this is any different than 21st century Europe or not, but the United States has traditionally, as you're suggesting, not been a country of great social solidarity. We're a country that prides ourselves on individual advancement. It's built into our cultural DNA. It's always been contested. But Americans really hope that they can be self-determining, autonomous individuals who create the reality of their own dream. And I think that's a magnet for people around the world, that you can create yourself in the United States in a way that's more difficult in other countries. We're a country of second and third and fourth chances. You're never tracked in the United States. You always have opportunity to recreate yourself. That's, again, part of our myth. It's not the reality of lots of people, but I think that's an appealing myth and has enough reality to it that you're right. It isn't just people are being deluded or tricked. It's kind of a rational choice. Which way does economic security lie for me Where does economic freedom lie for me? So, more complicated than tricked or not tricked. Conservative economics, there's a practical reason to support it, even if you're not rich. I mean, we're all kind of moving toward a neoliberal global economy, right? So it's something we're still all pondering. What's in it for me? And we make our choices. So we're living in a time when national borders mean less and less. I mean, you all have gone through this with a vengeance in Europe. The United States, while still self-contained, is a globalized culture and economy. And all of us, I think, are a little bit afraid. We'd be liars not to say, oh my God, the world is changing before my eyes, demographically, economically, culturally. It's nerve-wracking for many of us. Maybe if you're 16, it's just natural. If you're 20, it's just natural. But all of us feel like, what's happening? This life is not my parents' life. This life, in my case, is not the life of my youth. Is it fear? Yeah. Is it realistic to be fearful? Yeah. Can those fears be stoked? Can they be used to target groups? Can simple emotional responses be fired up? Yes. So there's danger in the fear. But there's real policy concerns. Every country in the world is trying to figure out what to do about these massive changes. Should we all become transnational citizens? A lot of us don't want to be. I'm typical. I'm a professional. I have a PhD. I've had 15 jobs. It's okay with me. I've moved all over the country. I've taught all over the world. That's okay with me. I'm weird, right? I'm strange. Most people don't want to do that. They're right to be afraid. So how do you manage that fear? There's a great line from Bill Clinton who said, we all are afraid. Some of us meet our fears with anger. Some of us meet our fears with hope. So look for politicians who offer you hope, not anger. So that's where I come out. We have to face the changes, not be afraid and scare ourselves into doing things that are dangerous for our neighbors and for our own future. That's a happy thought to end on.